alum of the
I
iSchool.
am 2008, Masters of Information Management and Systems. I love being back here. It's such a privilege and an honor. And of course, I love the genius students, and we want to hire them. So I work for ClearStory Data. We are fast cycle business analytics on more data. We're medium startup, about 5 years old, on a Spark backend, D3 for visualizations, and a lot of UX in between. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is the more data part. I have a few questions. How many of you would consider yourselves data engineers? Great. Statisticians? Awesome. Kind of even. And then I have a theory, but I want to test it. So when I count to 3, could everyone shout out their favorite programming language? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that was unanimous. Okay. It's good to know. When I was at the iSchool, it was all Java, so fine. I work in JavaScript. And yeah, but like, oh man, I read the curriculum and I'm so jealous. Excuse me. I'll be focusing on challenges gathering data from multiple systems in particular. I started programming in the 90s, and one of my favorite authors wrote this book called Close to the Machine, and she was doing system design and implementation in the 1990s. And what she said then was true in the 70s, and it's even more true today. And she just observed that I've never seen anyone with 2 systems who didn't want them to talk to each other. So now we're seeing people with tens of systems sometimes, and they still want them to talk to each other. I'm going to talk more about the sources than about the business analytics, though. I am going to give a shout out to a little bit of data usability and concerns. There are some real challenges. ClearStory Data, we work with some very traditional and systems that have been heavily in use for decades. And a lot of these systems are, they have custom encoding for their reporting system. I'm thinking specifically of SAP. Over the years, things that were tremendously innovative and useful and progressive in the 80s now are having trouble transitioning to the cloud, having trouble taking advantage of the new innovations, particularly in distributed computing and in speed of queries. I heard the phrase from an earlier speaker about liberating data, so that's kind of an ennobling way of describing ETL. Sometimes when you're dealing with very high cost, high stakes projects, it can be important to remember that people's jobs are on the line. There have been, I've recently had friends who worked at companies that had failures along the lines of $10, $20 million that get executives fired. So if you can use some of the awesome available libraries to decode data that has been locked in these proprietary systems, it's a really high value thing to do. And it means that you can leverage just some tools that came out of Berkeley, that Spark. Query speed is incredible. Some of the reasons why some of our clients want to transition from their systems to these more current data analysis projects is because they have billions of rows of transaction data. And when you're running a query on billions of rows, just 4 years ago, it was taking maybe 13 or 14 hours for a query to run. And I still thought that was impressive. It was on this powerful Oracle backend and relational database. And now, clients get frustrated if it takes more than 40 seconds. But usability of data analysis, we're really bringing it to this sort of like instantaneous, like conversational relationship, and to business users who have those kinds of expectations for performance. They're used to. And we're taking advantage of libraries that come out of huge social media companies that can provide that kind of like instant gratification and interactivity and beautiful visualizations. But today I'm just talking about getting the data, mostly. One example of a company that just had decades of data that was locked into a proprietary system is the candy company Mars. And they had this one reporting challenge where they could do year-over-year analysis of their marketing campaigns and their products for Christmas. And they could do it for Halloween, but they couldn't do it for Easter because Easter's on a different date every year. And they could specify date ranges, but it was the same date range year over year for all of the year-over-year operators and year-over-year functions and the drag and drop, universe SAP world, reporting world. So it was sort of gratifying when you decode this data and put it into a system where you can very rapidly kind of mix and match data sets and do joins very easily in the UI. So we just did a little calendar markup and showed them their seasonal reporting with Easter, just like a little like 6-line file that was like 6 years of where Easter is. And got to show them like what products sell and what campaigns work. And I was at 7-Eleven last week, and now they have like Halloween-themed cream eggs, Cadbury cream eggs. So I don't know if that's a Mars product, but I bought one. It's disgusting. It's green inside, because I eat seasonal candy. I eat like Halloween candy. This is more about complex disparate data sources. You've got your data set, you've got geodata, you've got your files, you're uploading files and using joins. So getting this data, there are three main ways that I do it. And they require sort of different thoughts and techniques. If you have a JDBC interface, you can write a SQL query, and it is a pleasure. I didn't know you could do matrix multiplication in a SQL query, so I'm going to ask the previous speaker for that. And what I love about SQL is that you can examine the data before you ingest it. So if you have thresholds, if you have criteria, if you want to do joins right in there before you get it into our tool, you can examine the data, and there's no like performance hit because relational databases do that beautifully. But when you're just looking at a file, you've got a bunch of Excel files and you're exporting them to CSV, it doesn't make as much sense to sort of examine the data at ingest time. You may as well do that sort of in the analysis interface. And then REST calls are kind of a third unique beast because it's implementation dependent. So you might be able to write a query, or you might just have an all or nothing thing, or it's completely dependent on, some companies, like a number of previous speakers talked about Salesforce data. And Salesforce exposes an entire query language to make calls to their API. It's like very fully featured and well documented. I see some nods here. And then we love getting data via APIs and then using our interface, which like this here. I should move on. Anyway, some of the features I think are so cool at my company. You can like look us up if you're interested in. This is like an instantaneous It's called data exploration, and it'll show you like correlation among all your metrics, including of combined data sets if you're just doing like joins in our UI. This is just one. This is one client, and multiple kinds of data, public data, databases, like a API for a CRM company I'd actually never heard of before. But then this one, this isn't even the interesting part. We do Google Analytics, but we also this company. They had field operatives at all these Walmart stores updating a shared Google Sheets spreadsheet. And they wanted it, like they wanted it on an hourly refresh schedule. And so we did this thing where we shared it we made up an email address. We shared the document with that fake person. And then we just copied like the authentication headers. And I guess maybe I'm over dramatic, but it feels like being like a fake person in the browser and like getting the data that way. And then if there's a formal API, a lot of Google products, BigQuery and their Google Cloud Storage, they expose formal APIs. So that probably would be a better way to do it. But we couldn't figure out how to do that with a shared spreadsheet. And we didn't want to like export and upload, export, upload. These are just a couple shout-outs. This is just like in the last month or so. I've had a lot of clients ask for so many third-party products because, like every client has their own systems. And so they ask, like, can you integrate my CRM? Can you integrate my IBM like process management? Can you integrate my Salesforce with my Marketo? I love Postman. If you're going to be gathering data and consuming APIs for third-party vendors, I highly, highly recommend just running through the tutorial. Google BigQuery or Apache Drill are just a couple of examples of sort of like free things that you can set up. Apache Drill is particularly good if you want to work with huge data sets. You can just get it locally and then expose the API and then just practice querying it. It's fun. But Postman, I think, is just really handy. I'm going to be switching topics. So once you get the data, now I'm just going to talk about one little organizational technique. The previous speakers, whenever anyone talks about IoT data, I still I guess it's not new anymore, but it still seems so sci-fi to me. So I was really excited when we got this big manufacturer who has just millions of dishwashers and sort of networking them, right? And the data was coming in as little JSON blob messages, right? And then we have to organize it into a table or into a relational model. And because we are an analysis tool, and you don't want to just duplicate it and then aggregate from multiple things, we used a lot of what are called like window operators in SQL. So you're getting the little messages and they have IDs and timestamps and little events. And then you want to find like immediately subsequent and immediately previous events when you're doing various kinds of analysis, like how many people are opening their dishwasher during the dishwasher run, or is your dishwasher going to break? I was so interested in the Hitachi use case where I was like, oh, they never break. Like, oh, that's impressive. But when you're, for consumer goods, they break and you want to identify it, you want to analyze it. So that sort of organizational technique of defining a window that is just subsequent events, and then finding like the most recent of subsequent events, and then doing your analysis that way, like throwing out repeated start events or repeated finish events, because that's bad data, and then finding that sort of like start and end when you might have multiple messages in between and you're getting device data from thousands of devices and you need to match on ID. It was very iSchool-y, so I enjoyed it. So this is my only shout out to the sort of user-facing features in ClearStory Data, even though we have a lot of them. I like this slide. It's a reference to the Don Norman Design of Everyday Things, which I recommend even if you're not into UX. I find it, this is the famous Norman door, where there's the handle, even though you can't actually pull out the door. So in ClearStory Data, in our visualization interface, where you select your measures and your categories, we only show you the viz types that you can use based on your data set. So this is just a fake data set with one category, one measure. And as you can see, there are only a few viz types that you can use. But if I had time data, if I had geographic data, if I had multiple metrics, then scatter, pivot, I just get a lot more opportunities and things that I can do, and that's based just on the data type. So I could certainly talk more about ClearStory Data, about affordances and data analysis, about gathering data. I have teenage children at home, and whenever I try to geek out with them on data analysis, they roll their eyes and start screaming. So I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to talk to a distinguished audience about gathering data and making REST calls, and whether you want all the data and do it at analysis time, or whether you want to narrow your query to be very specific. But that is my presentation, and if you're interested in ClearStory Data, please look us up or contact me after this speech.
All right, who can out-question a teenager? Yes, we'll get the mic down here. Thank you. Jennifer.
So I'm not very familiar with ClearStory. So just to kind of, it seems like what you have built here and what you're offering is basically, it's a tool coupled with some consulting skills where you go in, you help them pull together their data from their multiple disparate sources, and then you provide them with tools that allow them to analyze it more easily on top of that? Is that kind of is that the story around what ClearStory overall does?
The ambition is actually really self-service, business user-friendly, highly usable business intelligence, descriptive. Our use cases tend to be traditional business intelligence use cases, but getting the data is so frequently the biggest, the most time-consuming piece of that, even though the product, and it's software as a service, and we, and there are a lot of usability features. There's a social component, there's a lot of buttons for very common operations. There's a presentation layer that I didn't talk about at all that is this very sort of storytelling, executive facing for when you're giving a data presentation and organizing your data that way. But then I guess it's consulting because a lot of companies just don't have access to their own data. And so our techniques in just getting them to their data formatted in any kind of standard way, whether that's, and we support JSON, XML, CSV, relational, but we actually want to do less of that.
So then it, sort of at each level, if you think of it as sort of a, you've got to get the data, you've got to scrub the data and clean the data, you've got, like as you go through the stack to get to your actual analyses, what you've done then is create easy to use, ideally or potentially self-service tools at each of those layers to help businesses pull that together. So then how do you relate to a tool like a Greenplum or something along those lines? That's,
I'm not familiar with Greenplum. Is there another?
My company's looking at it. I don't know what it actually, but I believe it's like it's for sourcing data from across. Sort of like the data stays in place, and then you pull it together. It's an open source tool for pulling data together from multiple different locations.
Okay, so that sounds like an ETL tool, maybe like Pentaho or some of these other ETL tools. ClearStory Data is so ambitious, and I didn't found the company, so I could say it. I was like, you all, ETL. And the analysis story writing, including queries and choosing visualization types, all the way to this kind of like social and presentation and sort of reporting system that is meant just to be consumed by decision makers. Like someone else has done the ETL in the tool. We have connectors for various data sources inside the tool. And then we also sometimes do custom programming for consumption of, for example, APIs that we just haven't integrated yet.
Cool, thank you.
But I'll look up Greenplum.
I have no idea. I know that it's something that folks are looking at. And I'm like, okay, well, this sounds related anyway. So.
Absolutely, and we have this sort of growing relationship with Tableau users. Actually, we used to consider Tableau a competitor. But we found that so much of the value is in gathering the data, and then we have this pretty fully featured UI for specifying join type. We call it harmonization, but specifying join types and then creating data sets from really disparate systems or one table from a lot of different data sets. So now people are using ClearStory just to prepare data for Tableau, like because of the ease of selection and blending, and they're just using it almost like a ETL UI, which drives most of our engineers bananas because they wrote these beautiful visualizations and this beautiful like executive presentation storyboard interface with social. Anyway. I promised myself I wouldn't whine.
We got any other questions? Final one here. All right, it's like we're close to 5. Please join me in thanking Katherine.